rocky. And in doing so, they created that signature, that New England signature of the rock wall, pulling rocks up every few feet. They would pile them up next to where they worked, and these eventually became rock walls that you see running throughout all of the forests of New England these days. This was a major technological jump from the society before, and it changed the face of New England irreversibly. As society grew more and more around here, one of the things that got better and easier with the road systems. Instead of just being able to walk and carry things over various trails and paths, you actually started to be able to use wagons, and roads were cut from Boston along what now is the first road is along Route 30, which comes out of Boston as Commonwealth Avenue. Although these was a huge step upwards for the colonists, these things were constantly breaking. And in this corner, you can't see it too well, but this is a wheel jack. And they were constantly jacking the wheels up, replacing these wheels, which were light enough to be able to carry things, strong enough to be able to carry things, but light enough to be fairly useful in this rocky terrain. The beast of choice in all of this was the oxen. It's a very slow process, but the oxen was essentially a kind of animal that could work this rough terrain. Later on, as things got even better, they moved to horses. But we have here a couple oxen muzzles and a couple of the yokes that you'd put an oxen in to travel. Here, in fact, is a smaller, probably a horse or a cow yoke in this area. Moving over to your farm implements here, they run the whole gamut of things, from large scythes to forks to cranberry rakes. All of these things, all of these tools depended upon blades and metal that the Native American population did not have. Again, this whole ability to use this material transformed the area from a forest into, at that point, all agricultural land. As society got more complicated, also the various pieces between the groups in society were more formalized. In this case, there's a very interesting series of artifacts, which are the leather fire buckets. Now, when a fire happened, since they did not have back then a professional fire department, all the town's men who paid taxes and voted had bought for themselves 2 fire buckets. The 2 fire buckets, when they heard the fire bell ringing from the church, would be taken to a fire, at which point they would start throwing just regular water onto the fire until it was determined that the building was lost or they had saved the building. One of the fire buckets then was left at the site, and the town assessors would go by and check off to make sure that the name of all of the residents, the male residents, had been there. If the resident hadn't been there, they were assessed a fine for not coming to the fire. We're going to move from this now directly over to some of the Revolutionary War artifacts that we have. Seeing as there were no telephones back then and people couldn't call up, just like the men listening to the church bells to hear a fire, this is a signal cannon. This was used for occasions like the coming of a stage or other very important incidents in colonial times. Talking about cannons leads us a little bit into the Revolution. Framingham was no stranger to the Revolution at all. Most of the men in Framingham were part of the Minuteman militia. They were a highly trained group of farmers who got together to protest a lot of the English government actions. As a matter of fact, if any of you recall the concept of Paul Revere's ride, when there were lanterns shown on the Old North Church. The way the story goes, 2 lanterns by sea, or 1 lantern if by land. The 1 lantern was a signal that the British were marching out through Framingham to Worcester. There were 2 places that the British might have gone. One was up to Concord, and the other one was out to Worcester. Had they marched out this way, this area would have been the scene of the very first battle of the Revolution. The British elected to go to Concord because they felt that the colonists in Framingham were much too organized and well drilled to be able to handle. However, even despite the fact that the British marched to Concord, the Framingham militia actually made it to Lexington and Concord on that day, that April day, and played a major part. Even before the British had marched out to Concord, a Framingham native, Crispus Atticus, a black man, a former slave, had been killed in the Boston Massacre. He was considered to be the first man, or certainly one of the first 4 men to be killed in the Revolution. In this case, we have mementos of both revolution and to a certain extent hunting. We have several swords and implements like that, but also in particular we have several long rifles and some powder horns, a very fancy powder horn and some other more utilitarian powder horns. The earlier muskets used a black powder mix where the ball was actually stuffed down into the barrel, tamped down with a charge of black powder behind it, and they used a little pan with black powder in it that they would push out from their powder horn. These powder horns were made so that the powder was always dry, and a piece of flint on the musket would then clamp down and create a spark which would send out the bullet. The other parts of the Revolution that are less talked about were the music of the Revolution, which we have a stunning example of Thomas Nixon's songbook and his fife that was carried out throughout the whole Revolution. Another black man who fought in the Revolution, actually was given his freedom to go fight in the Revolution, was Peter Salem, who is credited with the killing of Major Pitcairn at the Battle of Bunker Hill, an event which apparently turned the tide of the battle. Many, many Framingham residents fought in the Revolution. They certainly were a hotbed of activity during that time. From this period, we're going to go upstairs and look at, on the first floor, to the 18th century collection. Ed Convery is going to take you through that collection of life after the Revolution. Thank you very much.
Welcome. I'm Ed Convery. I'm your host for the first floor, which is the 19th century. This building that we're in was an old schoolhouse. It was an academy, which meant that you paid to come here to school. We're going to show you around this floor and show you some interesting facts about Framingham. We start with the center of Framingham, and we have an excellent picture that was drawn in 1807 showing the center, showing Route 9, showing the original church at the end of the common. It's probably about the 3rd building now, but that shows the nice area of which is now Edgell Road heading out toward Knobscott and Route 9. The interesting fact about this Route 9 is where the stagecoaches came from Boston. And they came, of course, the old Connecticut path coming out, going to Connecticut and to New York. When the railroad wanted to come in the 1830s, the stagecoach owners fought them and would not allow this to happen. And of course, then they were forced to go downtown. And when they did that, then of course, everything else moved downtown with it. the new high school, the new town hall, many of the businesses, and this became a very quiet village after that. One of the other things that is very interesting right here at the beginning of this tour around this floor are the portraits. Now, of course, this represents the wealthy, but it gives us a fine indication of what they wore and how they fixed their coiffures, and the men with their long sideburns and so forth. I usually point out to our visiting third graders the differences in the collars, how our collars are down and their collars were all turned up. Their ties were very large cravats tied up in big bows. One other interesting point about the women, they seldom cut their hair. And so when they went out to formal occasions, they would put their hair up. When they come back and they want to relax, they let their hair down. And we still use this expression today when we ask people to relax. We'll say, let your hair down. If they did sell their hair, if they did cut their hair, they would sell it to a wig maker, or maybe they would even make it into a wreath. In our academy right now, in this museum, we have wreaths made out of human hair. As we move along into the case is a fine example of the clothing of that era, of that period. And of course, the portraits reflect what we have in the case. We had a split of the churches up in the center here in 1830. They had a disagreement, religious beliefs, and the Unitarians decided that they would stay in one church, which is called the First Church up at the end of the common, and the Congregationalists moved across the street, which would be on the other side of Edgeo Road right now. And then later on, of course, we had the Baptist Church come up at the center, and an interesting fact about that is they had a section in the church for slaves, which was very, very interesting when we get into the Civil War. This is a very interesting corner. We're featuring here the straw braid and bonnet industry. And this industry started again in the early 1800s. If we go down and back of the Baptist Church downtown on Park Street, there is a building there which was one of the original straw factories. When they started making bonnets, of course, everyone wore bonnets in those days, the women and the men, and they would take the straw and they would soak it and wet it, and then they would run it through these tools over here. This would make it pliable, and they could then shape it and so forth, and they could work it even into furniture for the front porch in the summers and so forth. And of course, everyone had a very large front porch, and this was part of their socializing, sitting out in the summer having their lemonade and so forth, sitting in rattan furniture, straw furniture. Later on, they had a method of making very fine decorations for the hats and so forth. And when they started making the bonnets, they put them around a regular block in the shape of a head. And then someone who was very artistic and creative made a face, and it became known as a blockhead. An interesting point here, we still use this expression when someone is not acting very sane or rational, and we say to them, don't act like a blockhead. So a lot of the expressions that we have today come from the past. As you look into the case and notice the very fine designs that they could make, there's little cutters that they can make it as thin as they want, and they could make stars and rosettes and all kind of beautiful decorations. This section has a fine example of the furniture of this period. It was built to last. You'll notice that there's excellent woodwork, excellent metalwork in it. This is furniture of the wealthy. This is not the common man. But you can see the beautiful gilt mirrors. You can see the lovely clock, the cut glass for the lamps. I like the stand with the pitcher in the water for bathing.